Quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your certified flight instructor, aircraft manuals, and current regulations before applying any of the techniques or interpretations discussed here.
Hello, and welcome to Helicopter Training Podcast, Episode 7. This episode is going to be a little different from the usual format. Normally these podcast episodes are deep dives into training topics, but I've always been interested in accident reports and the lessons they can teach us. So from time to time, I'll be mixing in these shorter accident review episodes, connecting the facts, safety resources, and the training topics that can help us become safer pilots. The goal isn't to widely speculate about the cause or second guess the people involved or assign blame. The investigators have already done the hard work of determining the facts. My goal is simply to take those facts and tease out and share the lessons we can all learn from, and hopefully help prevent similar accidents in the future. I'll be using photos and video footage from the accident investigation along with graphics and animations to help paint the picture. So if you're listening to the audio version of this episode, you might want to check out the video version on your podcast player or on YouTube. In this episode, I'll be looking at the final NTSB report involving a Robinson R44 low RPM accident near Mount Blanco, Texas in April 2026. Okay, let's get started. Around 10:30 in the morning on April 17th, 2026, a Robinson R44 Raven II was conducting aerial hunting near Mount Blanco in West Texas. At least that was the plan. Let's dig into the details and the lessons we can learn from this one. The pilot was 43 years old and held commercial and flight instructor certificates with rotorcraft helicopter ratings. They also held a second-class medical certificate and had conducted a flight review in both the R22 and the R44 the previous year. According to the report, the pilot had accumulated over 1,000 hours, all in helicopters, with approximately 900 hours as pilot in command, and a little over 400 hours in the R44. They also had recent experience in the R44, logging over 70 hours during the previous 90 days, including 15 hours during the previous 30 days. The accident occurred in the Blanco Canyon area about 40 miles east of Lubbock in West Texas, an area in which the pilot had not flown before. However, it was reported that the pilot had operated in very similar terrain throughout remote areas in West Texas multiple times. Based on the information available, the pilot appears to have been experienced, current, and proficient in the aircraft. One thing the NTSB does not reveal is the pilot's experience in this particular type of operation. That brings us to Robinson Safety Notice 34. Although written for aerial survey and photography flights, many of the recommendations apply equally well to aerial hunting operations, and it was referred to in the NTSB final report. Safety Notice 34 recommends that these types of missions be conducted by well-trained and experienced pilots, with at least 500 hours of pilot in command time in helicopters and 100 hours in the specific model flown. The pilot in this accident exceeded those recommendations. The safety notice also emphasizes extensive training in low rotor RPM recognition and recovery techniques. Unfortunately, while we know the pilot had completed a flight review in the R22 and R44 about a year before the accident, the report does not provide any additional information about the pilot's recent low RPM training or their experience in aerial hunting operations. And although the pilot was a helicopter CFI, they had only logged around 30 hours as an instructor, so they were not regularly demonstrating and teaching low RPM with students. Next, let's look at the aircraft itself. The accident helicopter was a 2012 Robinson R44 Raven II with just over 3,300 total hours on the airframe. The helicopter had received a 100-hour inspection about a month before the accident and had flown just over 66 hours since. According to the report, the pilot had also completed an earlier 2-hour flight that morning without any issues. The pilot reported the helicopter had been operating normally and there were no known mechanical problems before the accident. The helicopter was being operated with the doors removed. A passenger occupied the front left seat with a shotgun, while another passenger occupied the rear left seat with an AR-15 style rifle. There was approximately 1.5 hours of fuel on board at the time of the accident. Unfortunately, the NTSB report did not provide details of any performance or weight and balance calculations for the accident flight. However, based on the reported fuel quantity and some reasonable assumptions regarding occupant weights, the helicopter was likely operating below maximum gross weight, and performance charts suggest that hover performance out of ground effect would likely have been available under the reported conditions. So, at least based on the information available, there does not appear to have been anything unusual or concerning about the aircraft itself. The NTSB report cited weather observations reported 40 minutes prior to the accident from Lubbock Airport, which is located about 30 miles west of the accident site and sits at just over 3,200 feet above sea level, pretty close to the elevation of the accident site. Conditions were good, with at least 10 miles of visibility and the lowest cloud layer being a scattered layer above 10,000 feet. Temperatures were reported at 22 degrees centigrade, which is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, resulting in a density altitude of approximately 5,200. So density altitude was certainly starting to get up there. Winds were reported from 220 at the southwest at 14 knots, and the pilot later estimated winds in the accident area to be around 15 knots with gusts reaching 30. Being in a canyon, the pilot also reported some light terrain-induced turbulence. Higher density altitude, gusty turbulent winds, unfamiliar area, begin to reduce the available margin for error when operating low level, which brings us to the purpose of this flight. The mission was to locate coyotes or wild pigs and then maneuver the helicopter into a position that would give the shooters the proper angle and range to engage the targets, often while the animals were moving. By the nature of the mission, this type of flying can involve low level, relatively low airspeeds, frequent aggressive maneuvering, and the need to maintain visual contact with the target. During an NTSB telephone interview with the operator, these maneuvers were described as low-level aggressive turns. And while some pilots might hear that and think, now that sounds like fun flying, it's worth recognizing that this can be some of the most demanding and potentially hazardous flying you can do. In fact, the US Helicopter Safety Team analyzed 104 fatal helicopter accidents and found that loss of control and low-altitude operations together accounted for roughly one-third of the accidents studied. This accident involved both low-level and loss of control. Robinson's Safety Nurse 34 again offers some valuable advice. It emphasizes that pilots should only fly the aircraft at speeds, altitudes, and wind angles that are safe and that allow for good escape routes. Another recommendation in the Safety Nurse is that pilots must be willing to say no to the observer or photographer. It is not reported that the hunters in this accident asked the pilot to fly slower or lower. In fact, they may not have asked for anything at all. But the expectations of the flight were known, and as pilots, we often place pressure on ourselves because we want to achieve the mission and give our passengers the experience they paid for. I think most helicopter pilots can put themselves in this situation. You spot the target, begin maneuvering back into position, and naturally want to maintain sight of the animal and not lose the opportunity to set up the shot. But we need to remember, the passenger's mission should never become the pilot's emergency. And with that in mind, let's look at how this accident sequence unfolded. The accident flight started around 10:15 a.m. with the two hunters on board. About 25 minutes later, two coyotes were spotted. At the time, the helicopter was flying approximately 75 feet above the ground and around 50 knots. The pilot stated that he told the hunters to wait while he turned the helicopter into the wind. As the helicopter entered a left turn, the pilot reported hearing the RPM decrease. After checking the gauges, he noted that both engine and rotor RPM were decreasing. Unfortunately, the report doesn't indicate how low those RPMs got. The pilot stated that he rolled on throttle and lowered the collective, but the RPMs continued to decay. The pilot then began looking for a suitable forced landing spot and turned north towards a more open area. At that point, the passengers asked if they were going down, and the pilot replied yes. Because of the low altitude and the canyon terrain, ADSB data did not capture the final position of the flight. However, the pilot provided a screenshot of the track recorded on a cell phone application. The flight track appears consistent with the pilot's description, showing a tight left turn as the helicopter maneuvered back into the wind, followed by a turn towards the north as the pilot searched for a more suitable landing area. As the helicopter approached the ground, the pilot began to flare and then raised the collective to cushion the landing. The skids touched down and the helicopter slid forward before rocking onto its nose. The rotor blades struck the ground and the helicopter rolled onto its left side. The helicopter sustained substantial damage to the main rotor system, fuselage, tail cone, and tail rotor system. Fortunately, only 2 of the occupants suffered minor injuries, and everyone was able to escape the aircraft. This was a Class 4 investigation, the NTSB's lowest complexity category for aviation accidents. These investigations are intended for accidents with relatively straightforward sequences of events and a limited scope. As a result, the NTSB did not travel to the accident site, and the final report was completed relatively quickly, about a month after the accident. But before we move on to the probable cause, it's worth noting some of the finding categories identified by the investigators, including aircraft control, task monitoring and vigilance, recognition of the developing situation, and failure to maintain rotor and engine RPM. We'll come back to many of these themes later. Based on the available evidence, the NTSB determined the probable cause of the accident was the pilot's failure to maintain proper main rotor RPM during a low-level turn, which resulted in the main rotor RPM drooping, a loss of control at an altitude too low for recovery, and a subsequent impact with terrain. The NTSB answered an important question. Why did this accident happen? As pilots, I think we always need to ask another question. What can we learn from this? 3 themes stand out to me: distraction, energy management, and of course, low rotor RPM. And I think they're all related. Distraction can lead to poor energy management can lead to low rotor RPM, and once rotor RPM starts to decay, recovery may require more altitude, more airspeed, and more time than you actually have, which brings us right back to energy management. Let's first look at distraction. Imagine yourself as the pilot, flying low in an unfamiliar area. You're watching the terrain, you're watching the target, trying to position the helicopter for the clients, but the targets are moving and there's a lot happening at once. And this is where distraction doesn't necessarily mean texting or talking on the radio or fiddling with an iPad. Sometimes distraction just means the mission starts taking more attention than the aircraft. Robinson, Safety Nurse 34, describes a pilot maneuvering for the best angle, then losing track of airspeed and wind conditions. The helicopter loses performance, begins to settle, and the pilot may raise collective to stop the descent, reducing RPM and making the situation even worse. We must always remember to fly the aircraft first. Everything else must come second, especially at low altitude. A pilot's priorities should be aviate, navigate, communicate, then eradicate. Coyotes are optional, rotor RPM is not. And yes, maybe the clients will miss the opportunity, maybe the coyote gets to live another day, but so do you, and that's the point. In any kind of flying, particularly low-level flying, we need to be mindful of energy management. And as any R44 pilot knows, this is one of the required topics covered in SFAR 73 ground training. When we think about energy management, we often think about power-off situations such as an engine or drive system failure. We think about the height velocity diagram and the various buckets or reserves of energy available to maintain RPM, altitude, airspeed, and the rotor RPM itself, or if you prefer, potential kinetic and rotational inertia. But there's always another side to energy management, and that is power on. With the engine running, energy management becomes a balance between energy available and energy required. We need the engine and rotor system to provide enough energy to satisfy the demands of maneuvering and, most importantly, maintaining rotor RPM. Part of that picture is hover out-of-ground effect performance. Based on the information available, the helicopter in this accident was probably capable of hovering out-of-ground effect under the conditions that day, so this was likely not a contributing factor. But maneuvering also plays into energy management. In steep, aggressive turns, load factor increases, effectively doubling the weight of the helicopter in a 60-degree bank. And some of the lift that was holding the helicopter up is now being used to turn the aircraft. To maintain altitude, especially close to ground, additional total lift is required, and that usually means the pilot either raising the collective, trading airspeed, or both. According to the report, the helicopter was flying at approximately 50 knots when the coyotes were spotted, already below the R44's maximum rate of climb speed of 55 knots, which also corresponds to approximately the LD max. Below that speed, any reduction in airspeed means the aircraft requires more power to maintain altitude. And increasing collective increases blade pitch, but of course also increases rotor drag. If the additional drag increases faster than the engine can provide the additional horsepower, or if the engine reaches full throttle, rotor RPM will begin to decay. This is often referred to as overpitching. In a telephone interview with the NTSB, the operator stated that it was likely the pilot, while performing a low-level aggressive turn chasing the coyotes, drooped the rotor system and was unable to recover because of the low altitude. This all highlights an important lesson. Power on energy management is vitally important close to the ground, where the margin for error can become very small. Finally, let's talk about low rotor RPM. Robinson Safety Notice 10 states that a primary cause of fatal accidents in light helicopters is failure to maintain rotor RPM. The pilot reported hearing the RPM decay and confirmed the condition by checking the gauges. They then attempted to recover RPM by lowering collective and rolling on throttle. Unfortunately, the RPMs continued to decay. As Safety Nurse 10 explains, power available from the engine is directly proportional to RPM. So a 10% drop in RPM means a 10% reduction in the power available from the engine. It's a little like trying to drive a manual transmission car up a steep hill in 5th gear. Even with the pedal to the metal, the engine will be bogged down until the engine RPMs increase. And that's why pilots need to remember the power of aft cyclic. Remember those buckets of energy we talked about earlier? Airspeed is one of them, power off or power on. By applying aft cyclic, we can temporarily trade some of that kinetic energy back into the rotor RPM and help the engine return to an RPM range where it can once again produce maximum power. As Robinson Safety Nurse 10 states, in forward flight, applying aft cyclic to bleed off airspeed will also help recover lost RPM. There was no mention of aft cyclic in this accident, and we don't know the reason for that. But it's an important part of low RPM recovery training, and I think this is something pilots sometimes forget. I've watched cockpit videos of low RPM events where there was still plenty of airspeed available, yet the horn sounded all the way down, without that airspeed ever being traded back into the rotor system. Remember, if you have airspeed available, use it with some aft cyclic to help build those RPMs back. And if you're a student and it's been a while since you practiced low RPM recognition recovery, especially using aft cyclic, ask your instructor. And interestingly, another part of Safety Nurse 10 almost eerily describes the final few seconds of this accident. Robinson emphasizes the importance of flying the aircraft all the way to the ground, lowering collective to maintain RPM, and executing a flare at the bottom to reduce airspeed and rate of descent. The safety nurse then goes on to explain that the helicopter may roll over and be severely damaged, but the occupants will have an excellent chance of walking away. And that is pretty much how it happened. The helicopter was substantially damaged and rolled over, but all 3 occupants survived and 2 suffered only minor injuries. There's an old saying that any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. And while I don't think any of us would go so far as to describe this as a good landing, everyone did walk away, and sometimes that's the most successful outcome. And finally, circling back to energy management, even if you recognize low RPM and you apply the corrective techniques to recover the RPMs, you still need enough altitude available to make it all work. So, don't let the mission distract you from flying the aircraft. Respect energy management, especially close to the ground. Remember the power of aft cyclic to rebuild RPM. And of course, watch out for those wily coyotes. Thank you for tuning in to the Helicopter Training Podcast. So if you found this episode useful, please take a moment, rate and review the show in your podcast app, because those reviews and ratings make a huge difference helping others discover the show and grow the community. Please also just share the podcast with any friends or colleagues or anyone else you think would be passionate about helicopters. Don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you never miss a future episode. And we'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, topic suggestions, or want to share your experiences, your frustrations, and your successes, head out to helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. Your feedback really helps improve the show, make each episode even better. Finally, if you found value in this podcast, please visit helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/support. And there you can find a bunch of ways to support the show, both financially and otherwise, to help the show keep going. Thanks again for listening, fly safe, and we'll see you on the next episode.